All right, so this is kind of my second video, and I'm just going to kind of go over parts of the Kote and what it is that I am looking for when I'm doing a repair. Oftentimes, what people are concerned about is they'll start getting these holes worn into the Kote. Periodically, you'll have them worn into this trim. They'll wear a hole through that. They'll have holes here. A lot of times the hemo, the string here, they can be worn through, and this can break, so you'll sometimes need to get this replaced. A lot of times people will, when they get their Kote, they'll start messing with the hemo, and they might tighten it, or you'll see them where they get this kind of kind of tapered look. And ideally, from what I understand, this should be even, because what's happening is you want some gap in here. So when the chenille strikes the futon, the scoring part here, that there's actually some cushion. If you have it directly on, if somebody tightens this up and has it on there, when that gets hit, that's going to translate that shock right to the wrist. And so, that's one of the issues that you want to make sure that your Kote is set up correctly. In here, this is also starting to tear, but other than that, everything looks pretty good in this one. So this won't be a big deal. I start with kind of taking this stitching apart. It opens it up, and then I'm able to take the palm out without damaging the trim. I try and save the trim if I can, because that it kind of fits in better with the original leather. Sometimes I have to patch that in, and that's no big deal. Now, I recently acquired the set of Kote off of eBay, and you can look at it and tell that things are not well in this case. These were very nasty. I had to soak these and wash this area here. A lot of times this will get really grimy, and if it isn't cleaned properly, if it isn't maintained properly, it'll start to mold. And I wanted to kind of show this here. Here's an example of the type of mold that'll start to build up here. Now, other than, like, say, the color being off, like, this is leather, what's wrong with it? Well, for one, this is cow leather. And while cow leather is tough and wear resistant, that it's not very responsive to grabbing onto the chenille. And this has a real smooth surface on here. When I put this glove on, this Kote on, one, I can't barely even get my hand in there. And then trying to move it doesn't move around very well. So this is not the correct leather. Looking at this trim, this one is slightly better than this one here. Okay, this one is terrible. Somebody thought they could machine stitch this. And there's some rubber cement on here, and so they sewed this on, and then they took the trim that was with the Kote and wrapped it like that and tried to sew it again, and that did not work well. And there's also some rubber cement here. I'm just looking at this, like, this is not good. So, if you're going to send your Kote in to get them fixed, wash your hands before you're using the Kote. Try and get this stuff out. This is nasty. It stinks. It rots the leather. This leather is starting to rot, because it's not allowed to dry properly. You just want these things to be able to air dry. If you have a really, intensive Shiai, you're training pretty hard, especially during the summer months. You want to make sure that you're taking your Kote out and you're letting them air dry. I definitely recommend, if you're doing 2 to 3 times a week of heavy Shiai, that you should probably have 2 sets of Kote, and you can rotate them out, and you're always allowing them to air dry out, and maybe even wipe out the insides of them. Get some disinfecting wipes, like alcohol based, probably not bleach, but I would say alcohol should be fine. And just give it a good nice wipe down and let it dry out. Let's see here. So I got a couple different sets here that I'm working on. Kind of went over these two. So this is kind of Kote on the inside. And again, here's a pretty good example of like the buildup on the inside, and how the salt from our sweat and everything that kind of causes this stuff to dry rot. I'm looking here, I'm kind of debating what I want to do here. So this is dry rotted here, and you can just kind of barely see the deer hair under that. And just trying to figure out how I want to repair that. Here's an example. I had to do this leather in here was dry rotted. I took the embroidery out, and I'm debating on whether or not that's going to go back in. The customer, this is kind of I'm doing this set. There's several of them that I'm basically just doing for materials for a gym, and that they had a bunch of school sets that they would like to be able to put into service, but they can't use. And so, I offered to repair a bunch of the Kote just for the cost of the leather. So redoing this embroidery here, that'll take me a little while. So I'm kind of on the fence. So if I do that, I'll post that as part of a video so you can kind of see how that's done. Probably, I think what I'll end up doing here, it's kind of cool. So if you see how Kote are constructed, so each of these seams kind of fold back, okay? And so you can, if there was a tear in here, what I would do is I can open this up and put a piece of patch fabric in. And so you can kind of see where I did some stitching there, because this was coming apart and that was loose. I also was able to seam this in. And so that gave me a nice seam there as far as like how that comes together. And so once I get the palms put on this, that'll go back together fairly nice. Rest of this is in fairly decent condition. So this isn't so bad that when I get this put together, that might not take too big of a patch. Maybe just some piece of square. I tend to use fabric scraps from. I'd like to use denim. I'll also use like different like pant materials, and get that from a thrift store, say, and I'll patch that in. So here's the twin for this guy. So I'm getting set up to kind of get the first round of stitching for the for the palm on this, the Tanucci. Had to do some stitching here. I like to, I'll stitch the edge, I'll pre-stitch that. And that'll make sure, like, if anyone comes behind me, if this another set of Tanucci gets put on here, then the person who's going to repair it after me should have an easier time. And it should be pretty straightforward. So I try and make it, pretty easy to repair. And I also had to fix some dry rot here. This one was a little bit different process. Different part of it was torn, but pretty similar. Yeah. So I'll be getting this one going here, and I'll be setting up the initial stitching. And that helps me get the tension right in the Tanucci. When you see these done poorly, probably one of the first few sets I've done, I did not get my tension correctly. Fortunately, I was able to kind of go back and kind of fix that on them after I got some more experience in figuring out what I was doing. So that kind of that worked pretty cool. So I like to use these little clamps, document clamps. They work pretty good, and it holds it there and holds my tension. And I'm able to see that everything looks good. I use, if somebody's kind of wondering where to get my materials. So I found these online. So if you look up Tanucci template, I think Stroud Sensei out of Idaho in the U.S. here, I think he gets credit for these patterns. And so they were on one of the forums somewhere online. I was able to print these out. I put it on cardstock. And I've gotten many different sets out of each one. So you shouldn't, one set of templates should work. And so obviously for right or left, you're just flipping it over. The materials I use. So I live in northern Minnesota. And so we have a lot of white-tailed deer and deer hunters. And so at one of the local stores, they sell this really nice deer skin. And, for crafting, Native Americans in the area, they like to use it for different crafting stuff. So I'm very fortunate. You can look up deer skin online. This is two-sided. You got a pebble finish on one side. But where I'm getting it, it's not graded to the pebble finish. So this would be, if I flipped it over, that would probably not look good. And so I graded this piece to this side. So here's the, so this is a palm for this guy here. And, I'll get ready to kind of get that guy in place and get it stitched in. And, I'll kind of show how that's done. Some of the different tools I use, you can get these at most kind of like cheap tool stores. Get some forceps. Locking forceps are really handy. Seam ripper. I also have different little embroidery type needles to kind of pull stuff through if necessary. But the main thing that makes this possible is a sewing awl. I've seen other people do it without it. It's fine, but I am so impressed with how the sewing awl does. And it does such a wonderful job in creating a good stitch that's durable. I use a finer waxed thread, and it's a finer of the two needles that you can get with these. And that works pretty slick. I also, on eBay, you can find suture needles. And so my little toolkit, I do have some suture needles, and I use them for putting the initial stitch, and then also putting the trim piece back around it. And you'll kind of see how I do that in a future video. Let's see what else. The other type of thread, this one took me a while to figure out. It's hard to find this kind of heavier gauge thread, nylon, because organic thread or natural thread, cotton, stuff like that rots. So nylon is probably a little bit better for this. Same thing with the sewing all thread. It's a nylon thread. You can always check that. If you burn the end of it, it kind of turns into a little piece of plastic. So you know that's nylon. Cotton will just burn and turn to ash. Let's see what else. A little stick of beeswax for, if you need to re-wax that increases the friction, makes it so the thread doesn't loosen up. And oh yeah, so this took me a while. So this is a number 2 nylon thread, and it's a woven thread. So there's 2 strands to this, and I actually separate it. I'll split this, and that's kind of a pain in the butt, but it gets me the right gauge. And Hobby Lobby, random colors, you can get it for less than $1. I think the retail price on it's $3.50, so not too spendy. You can also get it from Walmart. I think I've seen it, and but that's for like specific stitching that I use the suture needle for. Everything else, I'm just using this type of thread. You can get this in black, which they didn't have the right gauge of it in black, and I bought a larger spool of it to save some money. But you don't really see it, with the exception of this. If I want to color that, I can though, and you'll see how that turns out. Well, that's my second post, and hopefully that's some good information for people. And you kind of learn about Kote construction and how these things are put together. And when I start throwing it back together, I'll post some videos on that. Thanks. Bye.